So good to have you back here with us.
Yeah, great.
So good morning, everybody. Great to see you.
Good morning.
A question to begin this morning. Really interested to know what you think, and if you don't know what you think, then just contemplate the question. And the question is, does your soul, if you believe in such a thing, have its own story? Do you believe that your soul has its own story? Any quick yeses to that?
Yes.
Any what are you talking about, Josh? Yeah, the idea being that for all of the stories that we tell ourselves, for as much in our everyday lives that we make our lives about the stories of tribulations and trials and problems and this circumstance and is this outcome going to take place, that back all of that, there's a deeper spiritual narrative, as I like to call it, going on, a soul's agenda that's not focused so much on experiencing the outcomes of life, but experiencing and embodying what we would refer to as the qualities of the Spirit. An embodiment of love, an embodiment of wisdom, of truth, of beauty, of goodness, and of joy. That's the idea of your soul story. And it sounds sweet, but I also believe that it's fact. I've learned in my own experience that something at least close to this is true in my own life. I like to refer to my soul's story as my last story standing. It's the story about who I am that's still there when I've ceased telling myself all other stories. And its question is, how much did you love? And how much did you allow yourself to be loved? Its question is not only how much wisdom did you ascertain, but how much did you live in that wisdom? How much joy did you become? How much fun did you have? Did you just acknowledge the beauty of life as it was fleeting by? Or did you stand and embody and say yes and truly appreciate it? Your soul's story is your last story standing when all other stories become insignificant. And I feel that it's not necessarily just an ethereal thing, the idea of the soul story, because I've learned in my own life when I'm able to affirm my soul's story, no matter what circumstance is taking place, my life improves. It helps me to not solve the other stories going on in my life, but it helps me transcend them so that something better can take place. So for example, if I'm in a fight with my girlfriend, I've learned that healing isn't the result of winning the argument. That healing isn't the result of being right. You know, I've learned that being right, especially in relationships, is way overrated, right? But what does lead to healing is that realization of love, a realization of harmony that helps make all the other stuff seem minuscule, and I remember the truth of who I am, and hopefully we remember the truth of who we are. Or for example, if I'm stressed or overwhelmed at work, it's not fixing a perceived problem that brings about a greater sense of harmony within myself. It's not taking control and fixing something that helps do it. It's a realization of who I really am and want to be in association with my life's calling. You know, compassionate, loving, and caring, a good listener. So when I remember my soul story in relationship to any of the instances going on in my life, that soul story helps raise me up. It helps bring me through those incidents so that I can see above them and beyond them. We're all telling ourselves stories in life all of the time. Some of them are true, some of them are false, some of them are part true. The whole gambit is there. Something that we practice as well, as Roger Teal points out in our book of the month, This Life is Joy, is something that he quotes from the author Debbie Ford, something she calls underlying commitments. Our underlying commitments drive our thoughts, our beliefs, and most important, our choices. They are unseen forces that shape our realities. Our underlying commitments are responsible for the discrepancy between what we say we want and what we're actually experiencing. These underlying commitments are formed by unconscious decisions we've made in the past. Have you ever got caught telling yourself two contradictory stories? Right? Because these underlying commitments, at some level, they can be really positive. They can be your values, your virtues, your principles. They could be the things that help you live automatically from the integrity of who you are. But if you go deeper, sometimes we may find that there are false narratives, stories that we've learned to tell about ourselves that aren't the true truth of who we really are. I remember at one point being in a relationship where my partner at the time wasn't living in accordance with who she said she wanted to be in the relationship and with herself. And I told the last service that spiritual talk for she cheated on me. And I had a friend say, why are you still with this person? And I went on a shtick about how I cared about this person, which was very true. But as I was sharing, I was able to really see as well that there was a deeper part of me that didn't think that a healthy relationship is something that I could have. That didn't really believe that something better was out there for me, and so I better stick with what I have. Which of course isn't the truth of me, but I think we've all, at times, we can look around at people that we love and respect, and we might be really surprised at some of the stories that they deep down accepted about themselves that we know aren't the truth of them, and sometimes how we can be guided by those false narratives about ourselves in our lives. It's not easy to break out of them, but one of the reasons I'm so grateful for having a soul story or believing in the soul stories, I believe that even beneath the false narratives we tell about ourselves, there's the deepest commitments that we make to our love and our spiritual growth. I trust more than anything about me that there is a deep commitment to be and connect with inspiring people, to try and be a creative presence for light and love in this world. And so I know that my life is always leading me there, even when I get caught up in the false stories. Sometimes I call this a spiritual sleight of hand. It matches that old story about the woman from the Midwest who meets who she thinks is the man of her dreams, moves to California with him, and 3 months later he dumps her. It's over, and she doesn't know what happened, but she knows she has a job interview the next day. She comes in, and it winds up being the passageway to the thing that she always wanted to do her whole life, but didn't quite realize it. Have you ever had the spirit or the soul work in your life this way? You think you're working it out to a particular outcome, but really the soul's agenda is taking place. I remember taking a job from someone who said, come work for me for a few months and then you'll take my management position. And so I said yes, and it was funny because I would have never said yes if that wasn't part of the offer. 3 months later, I noticed this person was much more comfortable in their job with me working for them, and that they changed their mind about leaving. But I realized not to be angry about that because there was that spiritual sleight of hand again taking place because I needed that job. It was the best thing for me. It was something that allowed me to be healthier and to lay a foundation for my later thriving in life. So not to say that the Spirit leads us through bad circumstances to get a greater realization of truth, but to, again, try to encourage us to affirm for ourselves and articulate what the soul story is in our life. What am I really here for? How do I really want to choose to show up in this world? It's recognizing the soul story for me that allows the presence of grace to enter into my life. It's the recognition of the soul story for me that opens my heart to be willing to forgive in my life because I realize there's a greater story for me than the minuscule or the trivial or even the tragedy that may be before me because who I am can move beyond that. I'm always impressed by the person who can take a failure in his or her life and use it as a springboard to success. I'm always impressed by the sports team that has a big loss, yet uses it to catapult them into a greater victory. What is it within us? What is it within human nature that helps us to do this? And I would argue that the idea of knowing what our soul story is helps us to do that. When I know my soul story is to be a champion, is to be a victor, then I know that my loss isn't the end of the story. It's just part of the pathway to achieving my goals. When I know that who I am is called to be successful, to bring about the highest and best for me and to serve humanity around me, the failure isn't the end of the story. It's but a step on the way. It's not easy when something difficult comes our way, sometimes to not see it as the end. But when we do, that's when we allow ourselves to become the victim, to become the loser, to become the unloved or unwanted or whatever stories come from the appearance of an ending in our life. But when we embrace the soul story, we see the eternality of our true spirit, our true self, ever picking up like a vacuum that embodiment of love, that embodiment of truth, that embodiment of wisdom that doesn't just heal our own hearts, but helps to heal and support the hearts around us. I firmly believe that life has produced us, whether consciously or not, for its own benefit. The Spirit has expressed us to give back to it in your own way. Whatever that unique expression of love, beauty, or truth, or harmony is for you, you express it in your own unique way. And when you affirm the truth of that in your life, that soul story unfolds through you. It reveals through you. Speaking of stories, I was a little heart-punched when I read the story, as some of you may have, about the 800 email acceptance letters that went out from Carnegie Mellon University. Yeah. There was an email acceptance. Jean read the story, and 8 hours later, they emailed all the students back saying, "Oops, we made a mistake." So one student reported he was so thrilled that he'd been accepted into Carnegie Mellon, one of the top 5 technology colleges out there, that he called his parents immediately, who called all the other members of the family, and they started creating a big party for a young woman who was initially accepted. Right after she read her letter, she called and she quit her job. Her boyfriend was so impressed that he proposed right there on the spot. So excited about their upcoming future. The email that went out said this. It said, "We mistakenly sent you an offer of admission to Carnegie Mellon's Masters in Computer Science program. This was an error on our part. While we certainly appreciate your interest in our program, we regret that we are unable to offer you admission this year." So devastating, right? Awful, right? End of story? No. And that's what we have to remember in our lives. It's not our place to bring meaning to why a bad thing happens to us. But it is our place to recognize that we can bring meaning even in the face of a meaningless, stupid event, like a wrong email, because we know the truth of who we are. So what do these students do? We don't know what they're all going to do. This just happened. Some of them may live the lie for a while. Some of them may be so angry, feel so scorned that they won't go to college or university at all. Some will allow themselves to be so victimized by the experience that they will allow it to define the rest of their lives for them. But then there are those who have a greater story, who know the greater truth of themselves, who will say, "Carnegie Mellon, I'm going to stick it to you, and you'll watch me, keep your eyes on me." Who will live and embrace and recognize this meaningless event, which it is, will be a catapult and something they can use in their greater story to help and inspire others. Embracing and embodying our soul story isn't easy. Sometimes it means sacrifice. Sometimes it means giving up what we think equals our success in terms of stuff or financial good to give in to living from a life of heart or a life of principles, which is especially difficult when those around us may not be practicing those principles as well. I love in Thiel's book, he tells a short story of getting to perform John Denver, the great musician's second wedding ceremony in Colorado. He says, "I remember sharing with John my immense regard for his music. especially the choice he made to direct the messages in many of his songs to the themes that resounded in his heart, especially ecology and world peace. I said that I imagined that this choice of direction had made a major impact on his career. He laughed a bit and shared that channeling his passions for human advancement into his music had made him the brunt of a great deal of judgment. A lot of my jokes as a teenager as well. Much of his audience shared his feelings and vision, yet there were those who were more interested in country roads. And his recording and distribution company, RCA Records, had chosen not to renew his contract, even though he was their best-selling artist ever. He concluded that it had all been worth it because he knew he was making a difference, and there was no way he could not include his core beliefs in the expression of his art. And if you know the story of John Denver, it was just a few years after that, when he was 53 years old, that practicing another one of his passions, flying, he crashed and left this world. You know, it's a reminder of what Viktor Frankl said about sometimes the best works are the unfinished. But his life is a reminder, too, and an example of not waiting to fulfill your soul's story. Not waiting to not just know the wisdom that you've learned in your life, but to live and stand in it. Not waiting to love or be loved at a greater time, but to claim this now moment as the perfect medium for your soul through your very being to be in the world in a strong and powerful way. Thiel in his book shares to this idea that I've been talking about as well, is the many stories that we tell ourselves, often false stories that keep or restrict us from living in alignment with our soul's story. He calls them the old, the cold, and the told. The old stories, he tells us, we usually formed in response to early setbacks and painful experiences. They are deeply rooted in our past, and we have told them about ourselves for so long that they have become our truth. Anybody ever had one of those? Anybody still operating over some of those? Those are those past stories, often very negative ones, that in the sense of their ending and encapsulated are awful stories. In them we feel broken. In them we feel victimized. But one of the issues with those stories is we deny ourselves the idea of embracing anything bigger. Sometimes we've had an old story and we tell ourselves, I am broken forever. I will never be enough. There will always be a hole in me that will be unfulfilled. We're unable to move that old story into being a now story where we realize that we can move on, not necessarily from the memory of the negative things that have happened to us, but embracing that we have made something meaningful out of ourselves in spite of the negative thing that has happened to us. By being able to help the people we love, by becoming someone strong and powerful even though we've been victimized. Whatever it is, the story that's taken place. Then there is the cold. These are the stories about ourselves and our prospects that have no heart, no compassion. They are stories that are not connected to our deepest passion and to our genuine caring. These, for me, are often based on my judgments and fears about others in life. And in this point in particular, I think Thiel is very unique and very insightful. The cold stories that we tell. I know and have seen that and witnessed that in my own life a lot. If I'm experiencing fear in my own life, I won't just form judgments about myself, but I might start forming paranoia and judgments about the people around me. All of a sudden, even loved ones, maybe their intentions aren't so good. Maybe they don't love me as much as they say they do. Maybe I have to watch out for this person. And what are we doing? We're saying those things about life too. Life isn't a safe place. Life isn't good. And so we begin to isolate ourselves into the coldness of not being in our heart. And we begin to, again, miss out on the truth of our being. We miss out on the joy of living our soul story. Lastly, there is the told. These are the stories that have been told about us, ones that people have proclaimed about us that we ended up buying into accepting. Anyone ever live in accordance with one of these? The story that we're not good enough. The story that we won't make it on our own. The story that we need somebody else at all times. I know in my own life I've bought into these stories. Someone will bring something, they'll criticize me about something or point out a flaw that I have. And most of the time they're right. Most of the time they are. But the point is I don't take it as recognizing that it's just a little part of me that they've been able to point out. I take it as the truth of the whole of me. And I start living in accordance with their story. Part of the remembrance of living and affirming our soul story for ourselves is stop living in the definitions that other people have of you and start living in God's story about who you are, in that higher vision of who you are. It's when we learn to do that not only do we break ourselves free from those often false stories that have been told about us, but that we can step and grow and be nurtured into living in our highest being. Steele goes on to make a really good argument that when we're living our soul story, life isn't so much about outcomes, but about quality of experience. It's not so much about what happens, it's about how much quality did we get out of each experience that we've gone into. He goes on to talk about what he calls the gold story. Life, he tells us, invites us to co-create a new story, a higher story, the gold story of our key life experiences. There is untold power in moving from the old, the cold, the told stories to the gold, to new portrayals of your life experiences that reveal the precious God-inspired you. The you has always been trying, learning and growing as best you can. The gold story about every experience allows you to create sturdy pillars of consciousness. For remember, your consciousness is the sum total of your most deeply accepted beliefs and the dominant energies that permeate your awareness. Author and anchor your gold story, and from it will unfold many bold stories of enthusiastic, courageous, and committed living. You know, there's the story about the person who's been hurt so badly that they never think they'll be able to truly love or be loved in a healthy way again. There's the story of the person who feels that they've failed someone they care about so badly that they could never connect intimately and have a strong sense of family and belonging as they once did before. There's the story of the individual who feels they've failed themselves so badly that they'll never accept themselves as they are again. There's the story of the person who feels that they've failed so badly in business or in work that they'll never truly be or able to call themselves a success or help those around you. I don't know if it's true, but my guess at some level, somewhere in there is part of your story, somewhere where you've held yourself before. And I'm going to guess, too, that you've been able to move beyond that story as well, that you've been able to step up to live in a higher truth about who you are. How did we do it? First, by the grace of God, but second, by being willing to affirm and know a greater story about ourselves, to come to what seems to be an ending of a difficulty and to say, yes, that was hard. Yes, that is part true, but it is not the whole truth about me. We were willing to step in via God's grace into being a more empowered, centered, open-hearted person that allows us to carry into living and breathing and embodying the greater qualities that Spirit has brought us forth to become and bring about in the world around us. To close with a quote from Holmes, we are to know that passing events cannot hinder the onward march of the soul. The temporal imperfection of the human cannot dim the eternal integrity of the divine. And one more time, because I think it's so powerful, we are to know that passing events cannot hinder the onward march of the soul. The temporal imperfection of the human cannot dim the eternal integrity of the divine. So thanks for your time, everyone, this morning. Thank you for